All right, people are going to come in because worship just finished a couple minutes ago. Really, she needs no introduction. This is our lovely, talented, dear Sandy Prouty, who is incredible as an educator, as a director of education for children and their families here at Montview Church for 22 years, something like that. One of the, maybe not hidden, but one of the extraordinary of many talents that Sandy Prouty has is education around art. And how many of you have had the privilege of hearing Sandy teach about art? And she has done that for our adult faith formation series at different times in different series. She is always a treat. And her perspective, the lens through which she sees art. And I think this particular series on Lament, through Lament and faith and hope, through the visual arts, has touched her so deeply. And I know that we will be touched and moved as well. So please, welcome Sandy Prouty to and give thanks for Sandy that she can offer these gifts to us as well as all the other gifts she has. Thank you, Sandy.
Oh, thank you so much, Clover. Am I on? It's always technology, right? Can you hear me enough for just a few initial words? I want to thank you for being here. It has been a very interesting time putting this together around the deep and wide topic of lament and faith and hope, and the place of visual artists and art within this topic. I'd like to begin with a review of terms. I find so often we think we know what we're talking about, but some of these words become so common that we sometimes can benefit from looking back and reading the exact definition. So, lament, a passionate expression of grief or sorrow. Tragedy, an event causing great suffering, destruction, and distress. You know, our faith tradition is based on lament. We know of the tragedy of the death of Jesus under torturous terms, and many artists have tried to capture images of that lament. This piece, the Madonna della Pietra, was done by the Italian Renaissance artist Michelangelo. He created it between 1498 and 1499. He made marble look like fabric, look like delicate faces and realistic hands. He made marble convey numbing sorrow. This is in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Madonna della Pietra. Many artists have done the Pietra. Even Vincent van Gogh. He did this in 1980, shortly before his death. He was inspired by French artist Delacroix. You can see his signature texture done with impasto paint. You can see his beloved yellow. He was the child of a minister, but seldom did he do a direct approach to his faith. This one again, a devastating death, devastating grief. This is one more version of the Pietra. It was done by a current Brooklyn artist named Lourdes Bernard. She used the bright colors of her signature palette. She included green in the cross and at the neck of Mary. She said that this represents growth and rebirth and the Spirit. Lourdes Bernard. This piece shows the Polish Renaissance poet Jan Koszykanowski at the death of his 2.5-year-old daughter. After this tragedy, he wrote 19 lament poems. And 300 years later, those lament poems inspired a Polish visual artist named Jan Matejko to paint this scene. He did it in 1862 when our father in this picture lived from 1503 to 1566. Lament is expression that can be revisited, and often. In our American culture, we sometimes seem to do lament well. We continue to face the pain. We feel, we mourn, we stagger in community at tragedies in our experience. And sometimes we don't. I'm not sure what the variable might be. It might be the scale of the tragedy, the horror of the circumstance. It might be the political winds of the time. It might be media coverage. But sometimes we turn away too quickly. We turn to optimism, which I see as a thin confidence in the world, a thin worldly confidence. We place our trust in our politicians. We place our trust in our American exceptionalism. We place our trust in our ability to name the other and then blame them. We place our trust in revenge and we go to war. We place our trust in social media and cynicism. And in all of that unresolved grief and sorrow that we have turned away from too quickly, we make very poor decisions. I want to take you back now to two tragedies of our American past and look at the influence, the bravery of visual artists and their creations. This piece was done by Peter Harvey in 1995. Peter Harvey was a member of the gay community in New York City. He painted sets for the stages on Broadway, and in the 1980s, as the HIV/AIDS epidemic took hold, he watched his friends, his colleagues, his professional connections die around him. The HIV/AIDS virus cut savagely through the gay artistic community in New York City. And in response to that, Peter Harvey gave up painting sets on Broadway and dedicated his skills to painting portraits of the victims of the virus. This piece is called Alas, No Phoenix. And you'll see in your upper left, there is a dead bird attached to the canvas. This is what artists do. They rush into the breach. They take with them their skill sets and their open, completely vulnerable, unguarded hearts. They listen with their hands so that we might see with our hearts. They do this at great personal cost of suffering and sacrifice. They do this in love, and they can't not do it. Peter Harvey's Alas, No Phoenix. In this time, as the AIDS virus was raging, and as government funding for additional research did not seem to be coming, between 1980 and 1990, 101,000 people died. This artist, J.P. Sars, started doing the same thing. He started painting the victims in the hope of honoring them. This piece is called Reflecting on Hugh Steers' Breathing. He painted it in 1990. Beautiful in every way, an impressionistic treatment of lament and tragedy. I want to talk with you now about an artist. His name is Keith Haring. You might be familiar. His style is very simple. It includes outlines of people in movement, and this, his signature barking dog. Keith Haring was born in 1958 in a very small town, population 4,000, a very conservative town called Kutztown, Pennsylvania. He always had loved to draw, and later in his life, he found himself within the gay community in New York City. Keith believed that art was for everyone, that it should not be locked away in museums that charged high admissions and excluded so many people, so he took his art to the streets. The first thing he did was make his drawings with chalk on the black advertising panels in subway tunnels. He gained enthusiastic and quick acclaim. He became part of the successful artist community of that day. And he also watched friends die. So he decided to make the change, to use his art and his signature style for AIDS education. He was just trying to find a way to save some of the people he knew, to try to stop the rage of this horrible disease. This is one of the pieces he did. His diagnosis came in 1987. He promised that he would continue creating with the time he had left, and that he did. This piece he did in 1989, again encouraging people to take care of themselves, to take care of each other, to act up in defiance of a tragic killing virus. Keith Haring died 3 years later in 1990. 1,000 people came to his memorial service at St. John the Divine. True to his word, he continued to paint until he ran out of time. This is his last piece that he was not able to finish. Keith Haring. Lament is hard work. It's truly no wonder that sometimes we turn away. But the gifts of faith and hope are in continuing to face it and feel it. This is the AIDS quilt. You may remember it was first displayed in October of 1987 on the Mall in Washington, D.C. At that time, there were 1,920 panels in the quilt, representing a snapshot of the loss of HIV/AIDS. About 105,000 deaths are represented. They were stitched by people in lament around the country. Now this quilt has 50,000 panels. It weighs 54 tons, and it is stored and archived in San Francisco. This display was part of the National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. I'd like to move to another tragedy now. And my segue is this piece that was done by Rembrandt in 1630. It's called Jeremiah Lamenting the Destruction of Jerusalem. Rembrandt used chiaroscuro, the contrast of light and darkness, to focus on his main subject. And here we see light surrounding a bereft, collapsed prophet who tried to change what is happening in the background of this work. Jerusalem is burning. We know of destruction in our national history. This artist's name is Keith Meyerson, and he was in Lower Manhattan on the morning of 9/11. He watched the first plane hit, and he spent his time trying to remember how it looked, trying to collect his feelings, sketching on anything he could find, so that he could share with us the tragedy of that moment. Darrell Walker, our presenter last week, said that in spirituals, often lament and hope are included in the same song. And I was reminded of that when I looked at this work. People have commented for all these years about how beautiful that morning was. Here, Keith Meyerson shows us a beautiful sky. And he's incorporated colors of hope in what we know was gray, black, acrid smoke. The smoke of death. But here we see pink and yellow. We see white in that plume. He's used colors of hope throughout this piece. And he also included the second plane. Keith Meyerson's collection of 9/11 art is now in the collection of the Whitney Museum in New York City. An artist named Todd Stone created this piece. For 15 years, he had worked in a studio and looked out at the Twin Towers every day. On this morning, the morning of 9/11, he and his wife were in the studio, and they saw the shadow of the plane go over their skylight. They heard the plane go over their skylight and crash into the building out their window. They started sketching and taking pictures frantically until they were forced to evacuate. This is entitled 8:45 on September 11th. One thing that was also often said is that people and paper were raining down. This artist, Eric Fischel, witnessed that and started sculpting. He sculpted what he called odes to those who fell and to the jumpers. This is called Tumbling Woman. He did this in 2002. It's installed in the National September 11th Memorial and Museum in New York City. I included this. This is an example of the paper that rained down. The Blue Man Group had a rehearsal yard near the towers, and when they went out, the yard was covered with paper. So for a long time, they incorporated a raining down of paper into their acts as their way of lamenting and memorializing the loss. $110 million worth of art were destroyed on that day. But this piece survived. This sculpture was done by Fritz Koenig, a German sculptor. It was installed in 1971 between the towers as a symbol of world peace. It was damaged, but not destroyed. He wasn't sure if he wanted it saved. As you can imagine, he was lamenting the reason he had created it, the hope for world peace. It was moved and stored and has now been reinstalled in Liberty Park in Lower Manhattan, near the memorial. The Spear by Fritz Koenig. You know, when we take the time to live lament, to be in the pain and the horror and the scale and the loss of tragedies, we can come to reflect more broadly on this human experience, on what Clover said last week, a reality that is so much bigger than we are. We can reflect on what humans are capable of, including us, for good and for ill. This piece seems to get at that sort of knowing. It was done by that mysterious, notorious British street artist named Banksy. It's a testament to his being a true artist. He painted this landscape. And then he added a person on a bench, enjoying it as we all do. As Dr. Butler said, in Colorado, your orientation to the mountains is something you talk about. And the person is in a Nazi uniform. He named this piece "The Banality of the Banality of Evil." He created it in 2013. Banality meaning ordinariness, meaning boring, lacking in interest, commonplace. The commonplace of the potential for evil within human beings. This is one to turn away from. I would be remiss if I didn't include this one image of the historic and continuing tragedy of racism in our country. This piece was done by African-American artist Frank Taylor. He did it in 2013. He is known for painting the people in his life. Many of his works are of his cousins or of relatives or neighbors. He brings a joy and enthusiasm to the culture, to his culture. And this piece is more about irony. We see an aged African-American man standing in front of the fields that he probably worked in his entire life, worked for someone else, surrounded by the word boy. And here's the irony. The title of this painting is "That Was Then." It speaks to the continuation of racially abusive language in our country. He has heard that word all his life, and hearing that word has not ended yet. We hope it can. Going back to our tradition, Lament is a part of what we know and believe. This piece was done by French artist James Tussaud in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He illustrated the Bible. This piece is called Jesus Began to Weep. It's associated with John 11:35. Jesus had just learned that Lazarus had died and he did not get there in time. Holding his face in his hands as the women look on, also bereft. And back to the beginning. Lament, grief and sorrow are part of our tradition. And if we can stay in lament long enough, we can find within it such important tenets of our faith: confession, forgiveness, redemption, reparations, restoration, renewal. They all can come from a time in pain. The pain of a tragedy, the pain of our being complicit in it in some and varied ways. And getting through lament to faith is the way to hope. Hope is a call to love and only love. Love that we reach for, love that we cling to, love that we share again and again in a world of pain. Banksy, in the painting that he did on the side of a building entitled "There is Always Hope," seems to see the connection between hope and love. Hope is our call to love, to let it go like a helium balloon into the world, to share it again and again and again, knowing that is our faith. Amen.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Clover had to run to the new members group and asked me to man the mic if we have a little time. I think we have a little time for a few questions, comments, if anyone has something to ask or share.
This is hard. Is everybody feeling a little...
Sandy, could you speak personally about how lament/hope has informed your own work?
Figuring out what to include. I came to Montview during a time of lament in my personal life. I had to face a large time of pain, and with my 4 children. And I feel that that was my way to this place. If you had asked me in 1999. Oh, I think you'll be working in a church in Denver, and you'll probably be there for 22 years, and that means driving a long ways every week. I would have thought, that is so funny. In fact, I even remember saying, I will never commute. You know, God has a sense of humor. But, you know, I don't claim to know how this works. Truly, I don't. I am humbled in the face of God and in the work of God and in this community. But it seemed that the pain led to this opportunity, and I had enough faith to say, I'll try it. And since I've been here, I've had the privilege of sharing Lament with so many of you around so many events in a well-lived life. It's not possible, I don't believe, to live a life without tragedy, be they big or large. And as we come together, as we can feel together and support each other, we find hope. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but it is what I believe. Does anyone have any questions about any of the artists that were included? Had you seen them before? I'd be interested in if many of them were familiar.
I was just curious. I'm familiar with Banksy because I follow him on Instagram, right? And so I'm just curious, what are your thoughts about him as an artist and the public works that he puts out? It was nice to see, you know, a painting of his that you shared. So I was just curious, what do you find appealing about him, and maybe is there a theme amongst all of his installations that he does in public and of paintings? Thank you.
Sure. Well, the amazement around Banksy is that still, after all these years, no one knows who it is. He has kept his identity secret. And as you all may see, it comes up in the news so often, all of a sudden this amazing painting shows up, and nobody really saw it go up. It must be in the middle of the night, or there's some installation that's created, and then before you know it, it's gone. So I respect him as an artist. I respect him as an attention getter. One story about him that made the national, worldwide press, actually, is that one of his very simple paintings, he uses stencils for a lot of these, so it's very easy for people to say, oh, he's not an artist, it's just a gimmick, and then he did the landscape that I showed you. That's why I included it. But he had done a very simple picture, and at Sotheby's, it had just sold for $2 million. Are you familiar with this? So it's in a frame on the wall to the side of the auctioneer. He completes the sale with a hammer of his gavel, and the painting starts moving slowly downward to be shredded in the bottom frame. It stopped about 2/3 of the way through the painting. So this woman had spent $2 million for a frame that now was mainly empty with shreds of a painting beyond the frame. You know, his statements are outrageous. I think he was talking about the ridiculous nature of the prices that art can go through at auction. But she kept it, and she's resold it for much, much more. But being able to come up with that idea and actually make it happen with no one, you know, no one was brought up on charges, no one knew how that happened. So that's kind of amazing, and these times. Yes.
Sandy, I wondered if you'd say a few words about your art and your life as an artist and your medium, your style, whatever.
Oh, sure. Well, art has always been a part of my life. I have an art credential as an educator, so I spent a lot of my time preparing projects for my little creators to do, and that's been the joy of my life. They have taught me so much. You know, at one point I worked in a school, bilingual school, with many young children who had just arrived in America with no English. But art is a universal language. Though at one point, I have to share with you that I thought, I have lost all my class management skills. I just don't know what's happening in these groups of art classes. And then I realized these children had never seen markers or paints or paintbrushes or clay. They hadn't ever been 2-year-olds that played around with it. So by the time they got to kindergarten, it was no longer like a birthday favor at a party. Every one of my art classes was like a party because they were so excited. Isn't that precious? Children are so authentic. So we got through the play stage. We just did it for a while, and then they began to create. And they, like artists whose work we see in presentations like this, follow their hearts. They just create. You know, as a teacher, I've done pre-K through senior citizens. I guess that's PC, I'm not sure. But, you know, with a group of children, you say, okay, we're going to draw this, for example. And they pick up a Sharpie, don't hesitate a second, and just start. And a group of adults, you have to say, okay, it's going to be okay. You can't make a mistake. It's like I'm coaxing them up to the high dive, promising them there's water in the pool. So, come on, we can't make a mistake. Just let go and see what happens. But it's such a different part of our culture. What happened between the 5-year-old who grabs a Sharpie and someone who says, I can't do it? But here's one of the tricks I've realized. They have someone along the way of their life who told them they weren't good, they weren't an artist. And I can't tell you how many adults have said, it was Mrs. Green in 4th grade. She said my horse didn't look like a horse, and I haven't tried to draw since. So, you know, it's a shame. But I'm inviting all of you to pick up a Sharpie and see what happens. You know, my art is based on collecting things that I find beautiful. And this is why I believe it's such a spiritual process, at least for me. So I collect things, I collect the colors I want to use, I have the format I think I'm going to use, and time after time, I have watched my hands change what I thought I was going to do. There is an otherness, there is a greater than, there is the Spirit and God that joins you in that process and opens up spaces in your awareness, in your heart, in your thoughts of others and your connections with the world through the artistic process. So what I do now is collect things, I paint, I rip up paintings and paste them back together, I stitch over it, I paint over it. I believe life is layered, and just honoring the layers of life never get you to a point where you can say, it's finished, I don't like it, or I do like it, or I was good, or I was bad. It's just a process. And the product is secondary for most of us. But I encourage you to try it. When you go to the mountains, take colored pencils. No one has to see what you do. It's a communication between you and God, and this beauty in which we know God.
Wow, Sandy, that's a wonderful place to wrap up. I just want to thank you for your love of art and your depth of theological insight and reflection and your gifts as a teacher, and they're all gifts to us, and so thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.